The morning of my father's funeral felt colder than it should have. Not just the weather, the silence in our house. It was the kind of silence that hums in your chest like a held breath before something breaks. The coffee sat untouched on the counter. My brother Ethan stood by the window, his suit too loose for him, his eyes too still. Mom was in the kitchen, pressing a handkerchief to her face like it might hold her together. And me, I kept pacing, waiting for something I couldn't name. Maybe for the day to end, or for Dad to walk back in and tell us this was all some kind of test. He loved tests. He loved making us prove who we were. At the church, people said all the usual things. He was a good man, a strong man, a pillar of the community. I nodded, smiled when I had to, shook hands that felt too warm. But inside something was gnawing at me, because I didn't know which version of him they were talking about. The man who built houses for veterans, or the man who barely spoke to his own son the last 3 years of his life. After the service, the family gathered in his old study for the reading of the will. It was the same room where he used to fix watches, tiny gears, endless patience. He said a watch was like a family. If one part stops turning, the rest follows. I thought about that as the lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. The room smelled faintly of cedar and dust, his scent. The air felt heavy, like everyone already knew this moment would hurt. The lawyer, a gray-haired man named Collins, cleared his throat. I, Robert Hale, being of sound mind, declare this my last will and testament. His voice was steady, practiced, almost indifferent, but each word seemed to echo louder than it should. To my wife, Margaret, he left a letter. Not money, not property, just a letter. To me, his oldest son, David, nothing. To Ethan, his adopted son, everything. The house, the business, the savings account, even the lake cabin, everything. For a moment no one moved. You could have heard the dust settle on the window sill. Then I laughed, a small, sharp sound that startled even me. I thought maybe he'd written it wrong. Maybe there was another page. "Read it again," I said. Collins looked at me, pity in his eyes. "I'm afraid that's quite clear, David." My mother's hand trembled. Ethan just stared at the floor, jaw tight, like he was waiting for permission to breathe. I felt the air leave the room. 28 years of being his son, and I was erased with a sentence. All those nights I stayed up helping him with paperwork. All the weekends fixing fences, rebuilding roofs. He'd once told me, "Someday this will all be yours." And I believed him, because sons are supposed to believe their fathers. Now that promise was gone, traded for a signature on a page. "Did you know?" I turned to Ethan. My voice cracked the way dry wood splits. He shook his head. "No, I swear I didn't." But something in his tone made my stomach twist. That calm, that restraint. It wasn't guilt, it was sorrow. And somehow that made me angrier. Collins tried to explain there was a letter addressed to Ethan, that my father had left instructions sealed in private. He handed Ethan the envelope like it was a newborn, fragile and precious. I wanted to tear it open, to see what words could possibly justify betrayal like this. But Ethan just held it, eyes glassy, lips pressed thin. He didn't read it, not then. Mom started crying softly, whispering my father's name over and over. I remember thinking, even now he finds a way to divide us. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane. Somewhere, a clock ticked, one of his old watches still keeping perfect time. The irony didn't escape me. When everyone finally left, I stayed in the study. The fireplace was cold, ashes gray. I ran my fingers across his desk, the grooves, the old coffee ring, the faint smell of oil and wood. I wanted to hate him. God, I wanted to. But underneath the anger was something else. A question I couldn't shake. Why? Why would a man give everything to someone who wasn't his blood? Later that night, Ethan knocked on my door. He looked pale, older somehow. "I don't think this was about money," he said quietly. I laughed again, bitter this time. "Then what was it about?" He held up the envelope. "Maybe it's about something he couldn't say while he was alive." I wanted to tell him to leave, to take the money, the house, all of it, and never come back. But instead I said nothing. Because deep down I needed to know too, whatever secret my father carried. It was still ours to face, and I had a feeling it would change everything. Families break in strange ways, sometimes over lies, sometimes over silence, and sometimes over the truth we never wanted to hear. The day after the will was read, the house no longer felt like ours. It was the same roof, the same furniture, the same light falling through the windows, but everything carried a quiet accusation now. Every picture frame, every ticking clock whispered you didn't belong to him after all. Mom refused to get out of bed. The curtain stayed closed. Ethan moved silently, as if afraid the floorboards might judge him too. And me, I couldn't breathe in that house without tasting betrayal. By noon, the town already knew. Small towns have a way of turning grief into gossip before the flowers even fade. At the diner, people leaned over coffee cups, whispering. At the hardware store, someone patted my shoulder. "Tough break, son. Can't believe he did that to you." They meant well, maybe, but pity burns hotter than anger. When I walked into Dad's company that afternoon, the construction yard he'd built with his bare hands, the men stopped talking. Every hammer fell silent. They all looked at me like I was walking through a funeral for the second time. "Morning, Mr. Hale," one of them said, voice unsure, like he wasn't sure if that title still belonged to me. Ethan showed up half an hour later. He didn't wear a suit, just jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt, the kind Dad used to wear. He had that envelope tucked in his jacket, still sealed. The sight of it, that one thin secret holding my father's ghost, made something inside me snap. "So," I said, "you're the new boss now." He hesitated. "I didn't come here to what? To gloat, to play humble. You think I don't see what's happening?" His face flushed, and for a moment I almost pitied him. Almost. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said. "Neither did I answered. "But I sure earned it more than you did." We were standing in the middle of the lot, two men who once called each other brother, now speaking through clenched teeth. The workers pretended to keep busy, but their eyes lingered, the way people watch a storm they can't stop. "You know what kills me most?" I said quietly. "He never trusted me, not once. All those years I tried to prove I was enough, and he gives everything to the one who never had to try." Ethan didn't respond. He just stared down at his boots, as if searching for words buried somewhere in the dirt. Then softly he said, "He did trust you, he just carried something he couldn't explain." That sentence, vague, careful, almost apologetic, felt like gasoline on open flame. "What do you know about it, huh? You were the charity case. He brought you in, fed you, clothed you, and now you walk away with his life's work like it was yours all along." The words left my mouth before I could stop them. They cut deep, not just into him, but into me. Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked at me the way a man looks at someone who's already too far gone to reach. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I never wanted his money, David. I just wanted to understand why he chose me at all." For a second, everything went quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause, but anger is a stubborn companion. It hates silence. "Keep it," I said finally. "Keep all of it. You and your mystery letter. You can buy yourself a family if you want, but you'll never be one of us." I turned and walked away, my heart pounding like it was trying to break free from my chest. Behind me, I heard him whisper something. A name, maybe, or a prayer, but I didn't look back. That night, the house was darker than before. Mom sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded around a cold cup of tea. She didn't ask where I'd been. She just said he must have had his reasons. I laughed bitterly. "You sound just like him." She looked up, eyes rimmed red. "Maybe that's why you never understood him." The word stung, sharper than I expected. I wanted to shout that I did understand him, his silence, his rules, his impossible standards, but the truth is I didn't. I only knew how to meet his expectations, not the man beneath them. The phone rang later, breaking the tension. It was Collins, the lawyer. He said reporters had started calling, local papers sniffing around, asking about the son who lost everything. I told him I didn't want to talk, but when I hung up, my phone buzzed again, a message from a childhood friend. "Heard about your dad. That's messed up, man. You should fight it. Fight it." The word stuck in my head like a dare. I poured myself a drink, sat by the cold fireplace, and watched the amber swirl in the glass. I thought about fairness, about legacy, about how easily love turns into paperwork when someone dies. I remembered Dad's voice from years ago. "Family isn't a word, David. It's a choice you make every day." At the time, I thought he meant loyalty. Now it sounded like an excuse. Outside, the night pressed against the windows. Somewhere, a car engine started, Ethan's maybe. I imagined him driving away with that envelope still unopened. My father's final secret sealed between us like a wall. I wondered what kind of truth could make a man divide his family like this. And then, for the first time since the funeral, I felt something colder than anger. Doubt. What if there was a reason? What if the story wasn't what I wanted it to be? I hated that thought because it meant I'd have to let go of being the victim, and sometimes that's harder than losing the inheritance itself. The clock in the hallway struck midnight. I sat there, listening to the chime fade into the quiet, and realized the silence in the house wasn't grief anymore. It was waiting for something to come undone, for the truth to crawl out from wherever my father had buried it. And when it did, I wasn't sure any of us would be ready to hear it. It's strange how death rewrites a man. When he's gone, people start painting him in softer colors, the sharp edges fade, the flaws blur. But memory has a way of keeping its own kind of honesty, and mine refused to be polite. 3 days after the funeral, the house began to feel like a museum of my father's silence. His coat still hung by the door. His old radio sat on the workbench, frozen mid-song. The scent of engine oil and cedar still lingered, faint but stubborn, like he might walk in any minute to finish the tune he'd started. I found myself wandering into his study again, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I wanted to find proof he had loved us, or maybe I wanted to find proof that he hadn't, just to make the anger easier. The drawers were neat, of course. He was a man who believed that order was next to godliness. Receipts stacked by year, warranties folded precisely, tax returns bound in rubber bands. But beneath the tidy surface there was a strange weight in the air, as if the room knew something I didn't. On the bookshelf, a frame caught my eye. It was turned backward. When I picked it up, dust clung to the glass, and behind it was a photo I'd never seen before. Dad in uniform, younger, sunburned, smiling in a way he never smiled later in life. Beside him, a woman with dark hair and kind eyes. She wasn't my mother. And between them, a small boy no older than 4. My heart skipped. The child wasn't Ethan either. On the back of the photo, written in my father's handwriting, were the words, "Saigon, 1991, my promise." 1991 was the year Ethan came home. I didn't know what it meant, but it left a taste of metal in my mouth, the kind of taste you get when truth starts to surface. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the photo in front of me. Mom, Margaret June Hale, though everyone called her June, had finally come downstairs, her face pale but steady. When she saw the picture, her hand trembled just slightly. "Where did you find that?" she asked. "In his study," I said. "You know her." She looked at the photo for a long time before answering. "I met her once," she said finally. "At the hospital, years ago, before we adopted Ethan." Her voice grew distant, like she was speaking to herself. "She was sick, very young. He visited her more than once, brought her groceries, medicine, said she'd helped him once when he was overseas. I didn't ask more, maybe I should have. I felt the room tilt. So there was a connection, something he'd buried deep enough for us to forget it existed." Mom's eyes were glassy, not from tears this time, but from something else, realization perhaps. "He carried a lot of guilt," she whispered, "but he never told me why. I didn't sleep that night. The image of the woman haunted me, her face, gentle but sad, pressed against a backdrop of old war photographs. I kept wondering if she was still alive, or if her story ended where Ethan's began. By dawn, I drove to Dad's old storage unit on the edge of town. The air smelled of dust and iron. Inside were boxes labeled Hale Construction, Medical, and one in his own handwriting, Vietnam Personal. Inside, I found a journal, leather cracked, its spine nearly torn. The first page was dated 1991. "There are debts that time cannot forgive," he wrote. "A man can build houses his whole life and still live inside one that's haunted." The entries were brief, scattered, not the kind of man who confessed easily. But they painted a picture of someone I barely recognized. He wrote about a fire, a woman trapped, a child crying. He wrote about pulling them both out and the husband who didn't survive. "She looked at me like I'd taken everything from her," he wrote. "And still, she thanked me. I've never hated kindness more." The more I read, the more the pieces shifted. Ethan's adoption, the secrecy, the strange distance between us. It all started to take shape, not as betrayal but as penance. Still, I wasn't ready to forgive him, because even if his guilt explained the choice, it didn't excuse the silence. I closed the journal and leaned back against the cold wall. A beam of light cut through the dust, and for a second I could almost see him, my father. Not the man from my childhood, but younger, afraid, standing in that smoky light, trying to build a life on the ruins of something he couldn't undo. The idea made my throat tighten. Maybe he'd spent years trying to repay a debt to that woman, and Ethan was part of that promise. But why hide it from us? Why let us grow up believing love was a competition he'd already decided the winner of? When I drove home, the sun was rising, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel angry, just hollow. I passed the church, the one where we'd held his funeral. The bell rang once, a low sound that rolled through the morning air. I remembered how he used to stop there after work, sit alone in the last pew, hands folded like a man asking for permission rather than forgiveness. I used to think it was just habit. Now I wondered if it was confession. When I got home, Ethan's car was in the driveway. He was sitting on the porch steps, holding that sealed letter again. His eyes met mine, cautious, uncertain. "I found something," I said quietly. He nodded. "So did I." He opened his palm. Inside was a small photo, the same woman, the same child, but older this time. And on the back, in my father's handwriting, "Debt repaid, but love remains." The morning wind lifted between us, carrying the smell of wet grass and something almost like peace. Neither of us spoke for a while. We didn't need to, because for the first time, we both realized we hadn't just lost a father. We'd lost the man we thought he was, and found someone we were only beginning to understand. Ethan waited until the light outside faded to the color of copper before he opened the letter. He sat at the dining table, the same one where our father used to read the newspaper every morning, his coffee leaving faint brown circles on the wood. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the wind slipping through the window gaps. I stood near the doorway, not ready to sit, not ready to leave. It felt like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't take back. The envelope was worn, the seal cracked with age. Ethan's fingers hesitated at the flap, the way you might touch the edge of a scar. When he finally pulled the letter free, the paper made a soft sigh, as if it too had been holding its breath all these years. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat, deliberate, almost architectural. Our father's words had always been like that, precise, controlled, never wasted. "Ethan," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I am no longer here to explain myself. Maybe that's cowardice. Maybe it's the only way you'll ever listen." I felt my throat tighten. Ethan's eyes moved slowly down the page, his lips parting slightly as he read in silence. Then, almost without realizing it, he began to read aloud. "You once asked me why I never spoke much about the past. The truth is, silence was the only thing that didn't lie. There was a fire. You were too young to remember. I carried you out of it, and I carried her too, your mother. But I could only save one of you long enough to say goodbye." Ethan stopped. His voice trembled at that last word. The letter shook in his hands, and I could hear the faint rustle of paper over the pounding of my own pulse. He drew a slow breath and kept going. "She told me to promise one thing, that I would give you the life her husband couldn't. I said yes before I understood what it meant, before I understood what it would cost." The light in the room dimmed, and for a moment the air felt heavier, as if the truth itself had substance, as if it was pressing down on us, making the walls lean closer. "I brought you home not out of charity," the letter said, "but out of debt. You were her forgiveness made flesh. I thought loving you would balance the scale. It didn't. It only reminded me of everything I failed to do." Ethan's breath caught. He looked at me, eyes wet, searching for something, disbelief maybe, or permission to stop reading. But I couldn't speak. All I could do was listen to the man who was gone, and realize how little we ever knew him when he was here. "I wanted to tell David the truth 100 times, the letter continued, but every time I tried, the words turned to ash in my mouth. He deserved a father without ghosts, but I was never that man. I felt a sting rise in my chest, a mix of sorrow and resentment, the ache of being loved imperfectly. Ethan's voice grew quieter. "If he hates me for what I've done, I understand. If he hates you, forgive him. It isn't really you he hates. It's me. It's the memory of promises I couldn't keep." We both sat in silence for a while after that. The last line of the letter looked smudged, as if a drop of water or maybe a tear had fallen there before the ink dried. "There is one more thing." Ethan reads softly. "In the bottom drawer of my desk under the ledger, there's a small box. Inside is something that belongs to your mother. Return it when you are ready. It may not bring peace, but it will bring truth." Ethan folded the letter back along its creases. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint crackle of the paper as it settled, like the closing of a door. For a long time we just sat there. The air smelled faintly of dust and something metallic, the way old memories do when you disturb them. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the siding. It sounded almost like knocking, like someone asking to be let in. Ethan rubbed his eyes and looked toward the hallway. "Do you think he meant her grave?" he asked quietly. "I think he meant her story," I said. He nodded, then rose from the chair, slow and deliberate, and walked to the study. I followed, my pulse rising with each step. He pulled open the bottom drawer, slid past the ledger. And there it was, a small wooden box, dark and smooth with age. He lifted the lid. Inside lay a silver locket tarnished at the edges, and a folded photograph, the same woman smiling faintly at the camera, a boy clinging to her skirt. On the back, in our father's handwriting again, were 3 words: "For what remains." Ethan turned the locket over. Inside was a tiny engraving, a date, barely visible under the tarnish. August 17, 1991. That was the same year written on the photo I'd found, Saigon, 1991. I felt the pieces shifting again, rearranging themselves into something darker, deeper. Maybe she wasn't just someone he'd saved. Maybe she was the reason he'd never been the same. Ethan closed the locket gently, as if afraid it might crumble. "He carried this secret his whole life," he said. I nodded. "And somehow," I whispered, "we were the ones who paid for it." We stayed there long after the light was gone. The world outside faded into quiet, the soft hum of distant traffic, the slow pulse of crickets starting up in the fields beyond the road. The letter lay between us, a bridge built from guilt and gratitude, spanning decades neither of us had lived, yet shaping everything we were. In that moment, I realized the inheritance wasn't the money or the land. It was this: the burden of understanding a man we'd only just begun to know, a man who built his family not from blood, but from the ashes of a promise he could never quite keep. The morning after Ethan opened the letter, the world felt wrong again. Not louder, not colder, just off, the way a song sounds when one string is out of tune. He'd barely slept. Neither had I. The truth we'd uncovered hadn't brought peace. It had only shifted the weight. We sat at the breakfast table in silence. The letter lay between us like an uninvited guest, its edges curling from the damp air. Mom moved quietly around the kitchen, not asking what it said. Maybe she already knew, or maybe she was afraid to. When Ethan stood to leave, I caught myself wanting to stop him, then didn't. He said he needed to visit the lawyer, to clarify a few things. I nodded, though I didn't know why he'd bother. Dad's will was clear, and words on paper don't change because someone suddenly understands them differently. But later that afternoon, when I drove into town for errands, I saw his car parked outside Collins's office. And for reasons I still can't explain, I pulled over and walked in. The door chimed softly as I entered. Inside, the office smelled of paper and rain-soaked carpet. Collins sat behind his desk, glasses perched low, while Ethan stood across from him, holding the same letter in both hands. They both turned as I stepped in. The air in the room shifted, like tension had been waiting for me to arrive. "What's going on?" I asked. Ethan hesitated. "We were just talking about the will." I crossed my arms. "I thought that was already decided." "It is," Collins said gently. "But Ethan wanted to ask about the addendum, something your father wrote later. It references a trust." I frowned. "What trust?" Ethan glanced down, avoiding my eyes. "A separate account, for maintenance on the properties. It's still in your name." It should have calmed me, but it didn't. Because the way he said it, careful, rehearsed, sounded less like truth and more like damage control. "So what?" I said. "You get the fortune and I get the bills." "That's not what this is," Ethan said, his voice low. "Then what is it?" I stepped closer. "You've been walking around like you carry all the answers, like he made you the keeper of his secrets. Why are you really here, Ethan? To make sure I don't contest the will." He flinched at that. "I came here because you deserve to know everything. There's more he left behind, things he didn't tell either of us." I laughed bitterly. How convenient, the chosen son still teaching me about my own father. "David," Collins interrupted, his tone firm but kind, "I know this is difficult, but your father made these choices carefully. There was no coercion." "Carefully?" I snapped. "He left his own son with nothing. You call that careful?" The words came out louder than I meant, sharp enough to make Ethan take a step back. Collins sighed, folding his hands. "I have seen many families torn apart by paper and ink. But this—" He stopped himself, glancing toward Ethan, then me. "This was not about favoritism, it was about burden." I stared at him, confused. "What burden?" He hesitated, then opened a file drawer, pulling out a thin folder. Inside was a document I'd never seen before, an old hospital release yellowed at the edges. Across the top, Nguyen Lin Burn Unit 1991. My stomach dropped. Collins continued softly, "Your father handled her expenses for years. He requested all records remain sealed, even from his family. Ethan's adoption came through that same year." I turned to Ethan. His face was pale, but he didn't look surprised. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew she was part of this." He shook his head quickly. "Not until I read the letter, I swear, David," but I was already moving toward the door. "Don't," I said. "Don't stand there and act like you're the victim in this. You're part of it now, whether you like it or not." Outside, the rain had started again, thin, steady, relentless. I walked fast past the courthouse, past the diner where people still whispered my name. Somewhere behind me, Ethan called out, but his voice drowned beneath the hiss of rain on pavement. I didn't stop until I reached the construction yard, our father's yard. Mud gathered around my boots, the scent of wet lumber and diesel thick in the air. I stood under the half-finished frame of a new house, the kind Dad used to build himself. The beams were raw, pale wood, fresh, innocent even, and for the first time I understood what he must have felt every time he built something new, the desperate hope that you could hammer your way out of regret. But regret always leaks through the cracks. That night the phone rang again. It was Collins. He said Ethan had formally requested to add me to the property trust, half ownership. "Your brother doesn't want this fight," he said. I almost laughed. "Brother," I repeated, the word tasting foreign. "Tell him he can keep his charity." When I hung up, I saw Mom standing in the hallway holding a photo frame. It was the one from Dad's study, the younger version of him in uniform. Her eyes were calm, but her voice was steady with something sharper than grief. "Whatever you're doing," she said quietly, "don't make him the enemy for something your father chose." "He took everything," I said. "He doesn't get to play innocent." She nodded slowly. "Neither did your father, but he tried." Her words lingered long after she went upstairs. The house creaked around me, wood settling like old bones. I thought about the letter, the woman in the photograph, the man my father had been before I was born. And I realized how far I'd drifted from the truth. Not because I didn't want to see it, but because anger had always been easier to hold than understanding. By midnight, I found myself back in the study. The letter still lay on the table, its edges curling. The rain had stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. I thought about calling Ethan, maybe even apologizing. But then through the quiet, I heard the faint sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Headlights cut across the wall. Ethan stepped out, soaked, the letter clutched in his hand. He looked straight through the window at me. And for a moment, neither of us moved. The night between us was filled with something electric, fragile, like a confession waiting to be spoken, or an accusation neither of us was ready to make. The storm passed sometime before dawn. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine, the kind of quiet that makes you whisper even when you're alone. I hadn't slept. The argument from the day before still replayed in my head, every word sharper in the silence. When I came downstairs, the house was still. Mom's room was dark. The door cracked just enough for a sliver of light to slip through. Ethan had stayed the night, though neither of us had spoken since he showed up in the rain. I found him sitting at the kitchen table, his hair still damp, the letter folded neatly beside an untouched cup of coffee. He didn't look up when I entered. "You should read what's in his box again," he said quietly. "There's more than the locket." I wanted to tell him to stop digging, that every new piece of truth seemed to bury us deeper. But curiosity, the kind that hurts more than it heals, has its own gravity, so I nodded. We went to the study together, saying nothing. The desk drawer opened with a soft groan. Inside, beneath the papers and the wooden box we'd already opened, was something wrapped in a strip of canvas. It looked like an old belt at first, stiff from time. When Ethan unrolled it, something small and metal clinked against the wood. It was a medal, bronze dulled by years, its ribbon frayed at the edges. There was a faint engraving on the back, "For Valor, 1991, but beneath that, carved by hand, were smaller words that didn't belong there. "For Lynn." The room went still. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Ethan traced the letters with his thumb. "She was the woman in the photo," he said softly. "The one he saved." I stared at the medal, that single word shining faintly under the lamplight. It wasn't military issue, at least not the engraving. That was personal. That was love or guilt or both. We found more papers under the drawer lining. A faded photo of my father standing beside a hospital cot, his uniform wrinkled, his expression somewhere between pride and sorrow. The same woman lay in the bed, her hand resting on his arm. On the back he had written, "She said thank you, I never forgave myself." I couldn't look at Ethan. All I could see was the image of our father, my father, caught in a moment he'd never escaped. Ethan folded the picture carefully, his hands shaking. "He must have kept this hidden for decades," he said. "He wasn't hiding it," I answered. "He was hiding himself." The weight of the metal in my palm felt wrong. It was heavier than it looked, as if the years themselves had fused into the metal. I remembered being a kid, seeing that empty space on the wall where his medals should have been displayed. When I'd asked him why he didn't hang them, he'd said, "Not everything worth remembering should be seen." At the time, I thought he was being modest. Now I knew it was shame. Ethan found a folded note tucked behind the medal. Not a letter, not even a full sentence, just a few words written in the same careful handwriting. "For the debt I could never repay." He stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "Do you think he meant me or her?" I didn't answer, because both possibilities hurt. We sat in that quiet too long. Outside, a bird called, sharp and sudden, breaking the stillness. It reminded me of mornings when Dad would rise before dawn, the smell of coffee and sawdust filling the house. He'd leave without a word, return long after sunset, eyes tired but calm, like a man constantly walking beside a shadow only he could see. Ethan finally spoke. "I went through his service records last night," he said. "They said he saved 3 people from that fire. A woman, a child, and her husband, who died on the way to the base hospital." I frowned. 3. He nodded. "The husband, he didn't make it." Something inside me twisted. The story wasn't just about rescue, it was about loss. Maybe that's why Dad could never tell it, because in saving one life he'd watched another slip away. When I looked back at the medal, I saw more than metal. I saw a man trying to carve forgiveness into bronze, to hold onto something solid when everything else had burned. Maybe the house, the inheritance, even Ethan himself, maybe they were all part of that same act of redemption. And yet standing there, I still couldn't let go of the anger, because knowing why didn't make it hurt less. It just made the wound cleaner, sharper, easier to see. Ethan reached for the medal, then hesitated. "You should have it," he said. I shook my head. "It's yours, everything else was." He didn't argue. He just looked at me the way Dad used to, steady, patient. The kind of look that waits for understanding instead of demanding it. Then he placed the medal on the desk between us. "Let's both have it," he said. For a long time we just stared at it, 2 men bound by someone else's silence. The light shifted through the curtains, thin lines of gold cutting across the wood. The metal glimmered faintly, catching the dawn. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But maybe it was the start of something close. That night I couldn't sleep again. I found myself holding the medal, turning it over in my hands, feeling the grooves of his handwriting beneath my fingers. For Lynn, somewhere between the letters, I thought I could still hear his voice, quiet, rough, almost pleading. "Some debts, son, are never paid with money." I closed my hand around the medal, and for the first time I didn't feel angry, just tired. And maybe for the first time in my life I began to understand what kind of man my father had really been. Not the hero everyone praised, not the ghost I'd built in my grief, but a man who loved imperfectly, and carried that love like a wound he refused to let heal. By morning the medal felt less like metal and more like a compass. It didn't tell us where to go, it only made it impossible to stay where we were. Ethan and I met in the kitchen without deciding to. The coffee maker clicked and hissed. The newspaper lay unread, the headline about a county fair smiling up at a house that had no appetite for celebration. I found Dad's old address book, Mom said from the doorway. She held it like a small animal, worn leather, corners softened by years of pockets and glove compartments. "He kept it in the box with the Christmas lights," she added, almost apologetic, as if the detail explained everything. A name was circled in blue ink twice, Alvarez Tomás, VFW Hall. Underneath, a number that hadn't been dialed in years, the 7 faintly corrected to a 9. Ethan glanced at me. I nodded. The medal, the photo, the locket, the name, each piece a quiet tug in the same direction. The VFW Hall sat behind the grocery store, a low building with a flag that snapped smartly in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of lemon cleaner and popcorn salt. A TV murmured daytime news. 3 men sat at a table playing cards, their laughter the kind that comes from people who have seen worse than bad hands. Alvarez was easy to spot, a broad-shouldered man with a scar that ran from ear to collar like a seam pulled too tight. He watched us approach, his eyes taking full measure before kindness arrived to meet them. "Robert's boys," he said, like it was both greeting and fact. "My name's Tomás. I served with your father." We sat. A vending machine clacked somewhere behind us. Ethan placed the medal on the table between us. The old man inhaled sharply. "He kept this," Alvarez murmured. "All this time." "He hid it," I said before I could stop myself. Alvarez looked at me the way a medic looks at an injury, without judgment but unwilling to pretend it isn't there. "Sometimes the only way a man can keep breathing," he said, "is by hiding the air he needs." He took the medal and turned it over. When he read the engraving for Lynn, his mouth tightened. "Your father saved people," he said, "but he never forgave himself for the ones he couldn't." The TV clicked louder, then softened again. Rain began tapping the windows in small, careful fingers. "Tell us about the fire," Ethan asked. Alvarez leaned back, eyes going somewhere the room couldn't follow. "It wasn't a battlefield," he said. "It was a tenement near the docks, old wiring, kerosene heater, bad mix. Your father was off duty, he heard the screams. He paused. We all did, but he ran first." He described smoke like a living thing, stairwells that coughed out heat, doors swollen shut. He described your father pushing through it, then carrying a woman down 3 flights, a child pressed against his chest. "The husband," Alvarez said quietly, "trapped with a beam on his leg. Your father tried, twice. The ceiling started to go, he had to choose. The fluorescent lights hummed. I felt the table steady under my hands. The room narrowed to the space between us. He came back after," Alvarez continued, "when the trucks had gone and the building looked like a burnt book. He talked to the woman for an hour on the curb. She kept thanking him. He kept shaking his head." "Her name was Lynn," Ethan said. Alvarez nodded. "She wore a scarf around her hair, blue with little white flowers, and she would not stop holding the boy's hand. Your father gave his jacket to the child even though it was August." He closed his eyes as if to fold a picture back into the album. "After that," he said, "he started sending money to the hospital, then to a community fund. He never said her name to me again, but every Christmas he asked if I knew anyone who could get letters delivered without return address." He slid the medal back to Ethan. "Some men hang their bravery on walls," he said. "Your father kept his in a drawer. That doesn't make it smaller, just heavier." I felt heat behind my eyes, the kind that comes when pride and shame become indistinguishable. Ethan cleared his throat. "Do you know where she went?" he asked. "After the hospital," Alvarez sighed. "Records get foggy when the people in them are poor, but I can tell you who might remember." He wrote a name on a napkin. "Sister Miriam, St. Luke's Medical Burn Unit Ret. Retired," he added, "but she plays piano at the hospital chapel on Wednesdays. Doesn't tell anyone the songs are prayers." St. Luke's was 3 towns over, a building made of glass and honest intentions. We found the chapel by following the sound of an old hymn that walked instead of ran. Sister Miriam was small and brisk, the kind of woman who remembered your name before you said it. Her fingers rested on the keys like they trusted them. "Robert Hale," she said when we introduced ourselves. "He used to sit right where you're standing now." Ethan took out the locket. Her eyes softened. "She never stopped touching that," she said. "Lynn, she kept it under her pillow when she slept." The boy, her gaze moved to Ethan, and for a moment the air brightened with recognition. "He used to hold it against his cheek when she was tired." She led us to a small office that smelled of paper and wintergreen. Files lined the shelves like neat rows of memory. "I can't share medical records," she said, and then, without waiting for us to protest, "but I can tell you stories." She told us Lynn's hands healed slowly, that she refused stronger pain medication because she didn't want to be foggy when the child woke. She told us a man came each week with books in a grocery bag, cookbooks, children's stories, a thin volume of poetry with dog-eared corners. "He never stayed long," she said. "Grief doesn't know how to sit." "Did she have anyone else?" I asked. "A cousin who visited once a month," she said, "and a letter from overseas that took too long to arrive. Life is like that for some people. Good things choose the long way." She opened a drawer and took out a single photocopy, yellowed, edges crinkled. "Personal copy," she said lightly, "to no one in particular." It was a discharge note, mostly blacked out. At the bottom, a handwritten line. Patient released to community housing, August 29, 1991. Contact: Father Jerome, Holy Redeemer Parish. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until the page trembled in my hands. Father Jerome died years ago, Sister Miriam said. But there's a storage cabinet in the parish basement that keeps telling the truth long after people are gone. She looked at Ethan with something like pride. Your father used to clean the snow from our steps before the sun came up, she said. Men like that don't disappear, they leave trails. The parish basement was cool and smelled faintly of wax and old oranges. A chain-pull light coughed itself awake. We moved through shelves of canned food and paper angels made by children whose parents loved them enough to bring them to pageants. At the back, behind a stack of folding chairs, was a row of metal lockers with flaking paint. Labels peeled away like tired stickers. On the third one, a tag hung crooked: H. Redeemer Outreach, 1991-1994. Ethan tugged the door. It stuck, then gave. Inside were 3 boxes. The first held blankets and a tin of buttons. The second, a ledger with names and dates, a lattice of small efforts. The third, smaller than the rest, bore our father's handwriting: for pastor, returned to rightful owner when found. Ethan looked at me. He lifted the lid. A blue scarf lay folded on top, scattered with tiny white flowers. Beneath it, an envelope, edges brittle, stamp foreign, postmark faded into a ghost of ink. On the front, written in careful English: for the man who carried the fire out. Ethan didn't open it. He placed the scarf in my hands. It was lighter than I expected, soft as rain. Dad kept looking for a way to finish a sentence, he whispered. The hall clock upstairs chimed the hour, each note a small, clear bell. Somewhere, beyond the basement, beyond the parish, beyond this town, I felt the past lean closer, ready to tell us the part we hadn't yet asked to hear. The envelope felt fragile between our hands, as though it might dissolve if we breathed too hard. Its edges were curled, the paper gone soft with time. Ethan turned it over, tracing the faint ink with his thumb. It had been sealed for more than 3 decades, but somehow it still carried heat. The kind that lingers after something has burned for too long. We didn't open it there. The parish basement felt too sacred for ghosts. Instead, we drove back through town in silence, the letter resting on the dashboard between us. Every stoplight turned red, as if the world itself wanted to slow us down. Rain began again, thin, whispering rain that coated the windshield but refused to wash anything away. When we reached home, Mom was sitting at the table, a lamp throwing soft light across the wood. She looked up, saw the scarf in my hands, and her face went still. I thought that was gone, she said. Her voice was quiet, not surprised, just heavy with the kind of memory that never learned to fade. You knew about her, I said. She nodded once. Not everything, just enough to understand that your father's past wasn't finished when I met him. The words hung there, neither accusation nor forgiveness, just fact. Ethan laid the letter gently on the table. The envelope had a red wax seal, cracked but unbroken. Under the seal was a symbol, 2 initials intertwined, L.N. He broke it open with careful fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, and a small photograph that fluttered loose. The photo showed a man in uniform holding a child wrapped in a wool blanket. The smoke in the background turned the sky to ash. The man's face was younger but unmistakable. Our father. Ethan unfolded the letter. The handwriting was neat but hurried, each word pressed deep into the paper like it had been written in pain, not ink. He began to read aloud. To the man who carried the fire out, it began. I have lived a long time with the sound of that night in my head. You saved me and my son, but you left part of yourself behind. I saw it in your eyes every time you came to the hospital, how you were grateful and guilty at once. You tried to make peace with what couldn't be undone. You must know this. The fire was not an accident. My husband was angry that I had written to you. He found the letters I sent after you left the service. He thought I was betraying him, but I only wanted to thank you for saving us once before, during the evacuation years ago. He blamed you for the life we lost when we left our country, and he blamed me for remembering you kindly. The room shrank around us. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's voice faltered, but he kept going. That night, he poured the kerosene in anger. I tried to stop him. He lit the match too soon. I felt my hands clench against the table. The story that had defined our father's guilt, the one he'd carried as his private punishment, was built on a misunderstanding too cruel to imagine. Ethan continued, his voice breaking. "You didn't fail to save him, Robert. You saved me from him. But I know you never forgave yourself for leaving him behind. I know because I saw you standing outside the hospital window each night, too afraid to come in. You once told me, a man is measured not by the lives he saves but by the promises he keeps. So I am keeping mine. I am sending this so that when my son grows, he will know his father was a man of courage, not of guilt." At the bottom, the ink was smudged, but one line remained clear. Tell Ethan, that he was loved before he was chosen." The letter trembled in Ethan's hands. He blinked hard, as though refusing to let the tears fall might somehow keep her voice alive a little longer. I couldn't look at him. My own throat had closed, a knot of emotions that didn't belong to words. Mom reached out, her fingers brushing the photo. "I remember that look in his eyes," she whispered. "The night before your father and I married, he said he didn't know how to start over with clean hands." She looked up at us. Now I know what he meant. We sat there a long time, the three of us caught between sorrow and relief, between loss and understanding. The house creaked softly, as if it too was trying to absorb what we just learned. The fire that had haunted him wasn't only flame, it was the memory of love twisted by guilt, of gratitude mistaken for sin. Ethan picked up the medal from the table and laid it beside the letter. "For Lynn," he said quietly. "Maybe it wasn't about debt. Maybe it was his way of saying thank you one last time." The words settled into the air like ash after a long burn. He stood, turned toward the window, and for the first time since Dad's funeral, I saw him smile, tired but real. "He didn't choose me over you, David," he said softly. "He chose to make things right with her through me. And maybe that's the only way he knew how to love again." Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled like a sigh finally released. I looked down at the letter, at her handwriting, at the ink that had carried her voice across oceans and years, and realized that we hadn't been uncovering his secret. We'd been uncovering his heart. Ethan folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. Then he handed it to me. "Keep it," he said. "It's as much yours as mine." I took it carefully, the paper warm from his touch. It was heavier than I expected, not from the words but from the truth it carried. A truth that didn't erase the pain, only gave it shape. The house grew quiet again. Mom turned off the lamp, leaving the soft hum of the storm outside. And in that darkness, lit only by memory, I could almost hear my father's voice, steady, weary, full of the kind of love that finally found its way home. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old paper, the kind of place where stories are flattened into exhibits and numbered tabs. People spoke in low voices that didn't belong to them, as if the building borrowed your tone and handed it back subdued. We sat at the long wooden table, Ethan to my left, Collins between us, my mother behind, hands folded, eyes forward. Across the aisle, a reporter poised with a small notebook, pretending not to stare. Tomás Alvarez had come, uninvited but steady, the medal in his pocket like a vow. Sister Miriam waited 2 rows behind, a shawl over her shoulders, a calm impossible to rattle. "Probate hearing, docket 14, the bailiff called." Our judge wore reading glasses low on his nose, his voice the even hum of a man who'd seen most storms already. "We're here on the matter of Robert Hale, deceased, and objections to the will as presented." He looked up, still objecting. Collins rose. "Your Honor, Mr. David Hale initially filed a challenge, but we ask leave to amend the filing to submit new evidence that may affect disposition, not in contest but in clarification." The judge studied us, an eyebrow lifting over the rim of his glasses. "Unusual, proceed." Collins nodded to Ethan. "We'll call Mr. Ethan Hale first." Ethan stood. He looked thinner under courthouse lights. He raised his right hand, swore the oath, and sat, palms on his knees like a boy at first rehearsal. Collins led him gently. "Mr. Hale, did your father discuss his will with you before his death?" "No." "Did you ever ask him for money, property, or to be named sole beneficiary?" "No." "Did you receive a letter from your father to be opened after his death?" "Yes." "And what did that letter concern?" Ethan glanced at the judge. "A promise. From years ago. It explained why he chose me." Collins passed a copy to the clerk. "Your Honor, we've redacted the intimate portions at the family's request. The salient point is purpose, motive for the distribution." The judge skimmed, silent. "This letter references a fire," he said at last, "and a woman named Lynn." He looked over his glasses at us. "This court is not a confessional, but motive is probative when questions of undue influence arise." He set the pages down. "Continue." "Collins called Sister Miriam. She moved with quick, economical steps. Truth seems to prefer a quiet gait. She spoke of hospital corridors and a locket tucked beneath a pillow, of a man who came early and left fast carrying more than flowers. She didn't read from records, she didn't need to. Her words had the weight of someone who remembers without trying." Next came Alvarez, shoulders squared, voice gravel at the bottom, river at the top. He told the judge what smoke does to a stairwell, how heat bends doorframes inward like curled fingers. He didn't make my father a hero. He made him a man in a bad hour who chose with everything on fire. The courtroom had the particular stillness of people learning something that rearranges them. I felt it in my chest, a subtle reshelving of the past. The county's attorney, a brisk woman with a pencil that never stopped moving, stood for cross. "Mr. Hale," to Ethan, "you didn't know of this promise until after your father died." "No, and yet you benefit from its fulfillment." "I didn't ask to." "And Mr. David Hale," she turned, "you initially alleged undue influence on the part of your brother. Do you still believe that?" I stood. The microphone caught my breath first. My mother's fingers tightened in the gallery. I could feel it without turning. "I believed what hurt the most," I said, "but belief isn't proof." A murmur ran like a small current through the room. I kept going. "My father made choices I didn't understand. I understand them better now. That doesn't make them easy, it makes them his." The county attorney paused, then nodded, the smallest concession to a sentence that refused to fight her back. The judge folded his hands. "I appreciate the candor," he said. "This leaves us with the will as written and a clarifying record of intent." He slid his glasses off, wiped them with an edge of his robe. "In cases like this, everyone hopes the law will feel like justice. It rarely does. The law is a map, justice is weather." He replaced the glasses. "Unless there's further evidence, the court will move to confirm the will." Collins stood again, a finger tucked under a tab in his folder. "There is one more item, Your Honor." I hadn't seen it in his file, something sealed in a small, gray case, the kind that could hold a flash drive or something older. He set it on the table, then lifted it for the court. "This was delivered to my office by Mr. Hale 2 weeks before his death with instruction to play in chambers or open court if the will faced objection." He looked at me, then Ethan. "It is a recorded statement." The judge leaned forward. "Audio, audio," Collins said, and a short note addressed to both sons. The clerk took the case, hands careful the way people get when objects start to look like moments. The judge nodded to the bailiff, who rolled a small speaker from the side table, the kind that usually plays evidence you don't want to hear twice. "Objections?" the judge asked. The county attorney shook her head. Ethan looked at me. I swallowed. "No objection." The bailiff pressed a button. The machine clicked, a soft mechanical swallow, and then a hush that made the air thinner. Static at first, like the ocean heard through a door. Then a voice, lower than I remembered and nearer, as if he were standing behind us. "Ethan," our father said. "David." My name inside his voice made my spine go rigid. I've never been good at sentences that start with "I'm sorry." Not because I'm not, but because I spent most of my life building around instead of through. A chair creaked in the gallery. No one moved. "I did not leave you the same things," he said, "because I did not give you the same debts. I wish I had only gifts to hand you both." A breath. "You will make of this what you need to, and some days you will hate me for it. I am asking you to postpone that hate long enough to hear why." There was a shuffle of paper on the recording, the click of a pen he must have held out of habit. "When I was a younger man, I ran into a burning building and came out with a woman and a child and a lifetime I did not know how to carry. I thought saving lives would clean me. It didn't. Love was the only thing that even tried." The judge lifted a hand, not to stop, just to steady the room. "I named you both my sons." The voice went on quieter. "But I taught you different lessons. Ethan, I taught you you were owed nothing. David, I taught you to earn everything. Both of those are wrong in their absolutes. What I should have taught you is that a family is not a ledger." I felt heat rise under my collar. It wasn't shame exactly. It was the recognition of a sentence that fit too well. The recording crackled. "There is one truth I never said aloud in your hearing. It belongs to you both to know. A pause longer than the others, keys settling, a decision crossing a distance. In my desk under the ledger, Colin's head snapped up. "There is." The speaker stuttered. A scrape of tape or thumb or time. Static climbed like a curtain in wind. The judge frowned. "Clerk, sir, the file is intact. It's the recording has a damaged segment." The machine clicked forward. Silence, then our father again, suddenly nearer, breath audible. "If you are listening, it means I've run out of days to do this in person. Take what I've left where it was meant to go, and the rest take to each other." The line thinned. One last sentence, barely voice. "Please don't make my love a courtroom." The speaker stopped. The room remembered itself. The judge held still for a count that felt like mercy. Then, "Unless counsel requires more, the court will adopt the testamentary documents as filed." Collins rose. "No more, Your Honor. Only a request to enter the recording and supporting letters into the record." "So ordered," the judge said. He glanced at us both. "I wish you more peace than paper can give." The gavel touched wood like a soft knock. Chairs rustled. Shoes whispered on varnished floor. Alvarez laid a broad hand on my shoulder. Sister Miriam nodded once as if to say that prayer had been spoken even if no one used the word. At the counsel table, Collins slid the gray case toward us. "There's a second file," he said quietly, "shorter, marked private." Ethan's eyes met mine. We stood, the room emptying around us, the door to chambers ajar. "Together," he said. I nodded, the word catching in my throat. Outside, the late sun flashed on the courthouse steps, hard and bright on old stone. We followed the light down the aisle toward the door that would close behind us and open something else. The courthouse emptied slowly like a wave pulling back after breaking. Papers rustled. Doors sighed closed. But Ethan and I stayed in our seats, the gray case still between us, our father's final relic. Outside, sunlight caught the edge of the window and painted long bars of gold across the table. I watched the dust float in the light and thought, he sat somewhere once recording this, alone, knowing we'd hear it after he was gone. The thought made my chest tighten. Ethan finally broke the silence. "We should listen to the second file," he said softly. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Collins had already packed his briefcase, leaving us a small player and a folded note labeled private for my sons. The handwriting was still neat, still deliberate. Ethan unfolded it carefully. "Play this somewhere quiet," he read aloud. "Some truths sound different in public." We left the courthouse together, neither of us speaking until we reached the truck. The afternoon was too bright, the kind of brightness that makes every shadow look deliberate. Ethan drove. The road unrolled between us in silence until the courthouse faded into the mirror. We ended up at the lake, the one where Dad taught us to fish when we were kids. The dock was weathered, boards warped, the water calm enough to reflect the whole sky. Ethan killed the engine. For a moment, neither of us moved. He set the case between us, pressed the small latch, and lifted the lid. Inside was a flash drive, nothing more ordinary except for the small tag taped to it, June 8th. That was 3 weeks before he died. Ethan plugged it into the truck system. The speakers crackled softly, the static breathing before the voice came. And then it was there, our father's voice, closer than it had sounded in court, as if he were sitting in the back seat, hands folded, watching the water with us. "If you've found this file, it means you've already heard what I said in court. This one isn't for the judge, it's for you, both of you." A pause, the sound of wind, faint, maybe waves, maybe breath. "I used to believe the worst thing a man could do was lie. But I've learned there's something worse, telling the truth too late." He exhaled slowly. "There's something you should both know. Ethan, when I took you home from the hospital, I told myself it was repayment, that I was doing what any decent man would do, but it wasn't decency that drove me. It was guilt. Your mother, Lynn, she wasn't just someone I saved. She was someone I failed before that night ever happened." Ethan's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Dad's voice continued, lower now, like it cost him to push the words out. "Years before the fire, I was stationed overseas. There was a family who helped us, smuggled medicine, food, letters home. Lynn's husband was one of them. I promised him safe passage for his family when we withdrew. I failed. The paperwork never came through. By the time I realized, their transport was gone. They spent years trying to get out. I told myself it was bureaucracy, not me. But you can't tell your soul it's not responsible. It doesn't listen." He paused again, a faint cough breaking the silence. When I saw the news about the fire, the names in the report, I knew it was them, the people I'd abandoned on paper. I drove there that night before the firefighters even arrived. The husband was already trapped. He looked at me, God, I can still see it, like he recognized the man who'd failed him once, come too late again. Ethan swallowed hard, eyes shining in the half-light. The sound of water lapping against the dock filled the silence between words. After the fire, I visited Lynn every week. She forgave me before I ever deserved it. She told me saving her and her boy was enough. But when she died, I realized forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just stops it from owning you. I never learned how to do the same for myself. I felt my jaw tighten. My father's voice was unraveling every piece of anger I'd carried like armor. I didn't know whether to hate him more for waiting this long or love him for finally saying it. David, he said suddenly. Hearing my name again in his voice made something ache deep and sharp. You were born the year after the fire. Your mother gave me peace I didn't think I could have, but I built that peace on silence. You grew up watching a man trying to measure love and responsibility. That wasn't your fault, but it became your inheritance. He paused, breath uneven. I wish I'd told you sooner that being a father isn't about fairness, it's about honesty. And I wasn't honest with either of you. Ethan got my apology. You got my shadow. Neither of you deserved the burden. Ethan turned his face toward the window. The water outside had gone gold, ripples catching light like tiny fires that refused to go out. I wrote the will knowing it would divide you, the voice continued. Maybe that's cruel, but I needed you both to face what I couldn't. I didn't want forgiveness from either of you. I wanted you to know that love, when it's real, always comes with unfinished business. There was a long pause then, so long I thought the tape had ended. Then his voice returned, softer. I left a note with Colin, something small for each of you. It isn't payment. It's a reminder that what connects you now isn't me, it's truth. And truth, sons, is the only thing we ever truly inherit. Static filled the truck. Then, a faint exhale and one last whisper, almost a prayer. Tell your mother I kept her picture by my bed. Tell each other you're not rivals. And if you can, forgive the man I was, not the one I tried to be. The tape ended with a soft click. For a long time, neither of us moved. The sound of the lake filled the air again, gentle and endless. Ethan stared straight ahead, his jaw trembling. He never said any of this, he whispered. He couldn't, I said. He didn't know how. I reached for the case, closed it slowly. The final warmth of the speaker still clung to the metal, like an echo of his voice. Across the lake, the sun was slipping lower, drawing a thin line of fire on the horizon. For a moment, I imagined our father sitting there years ago, looking at the same water, recording the same words he'd never say out loud. Maybe he'd hoped the lake would remember for him. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on the wheel. What do we do now? I looked out at the water, at the ripples spreading wider. We keep listening, I said quietly, until the silence finally sounds like peace. The next morning the lake looked different. Not calm, not wild, just still, as if it too was trying to understand what had been said the night before. The world hadn't changed, but something in us had. It's strange how a voice from the dead can rearrange the living. We drove back in silence. The old truck rattled on the dirt road, every sound louder in the space where words wouldn't come. Ethan had the gray case on his lap, his fingers pressed against it like he was afraid it might disappear. Every so often he'd glance at me, as if searching for something, anger maybe, or forgiveness. I didn't have either to give. By the time we reached town, the news had already spread. Someone from the courthouse must have talked. Small towns have a way of turning private grief into public curiosity. People paused when we walked into the diner. Their stares weren't cruel, just full of that polite pity that feels colder than contempt. The waitress hesitated before pouring our coffee, like she wasn't sure whether condolences came before or after the cream. Mom was waiting when we got home. She had set the dining table as though expecting guests, 2 plates, untouched food, silverware perfectly aligned. Her eyes, though, looked older than they had yesterday. I heard about the recording, she said softly. Her voice wasn't angry, just weary, the kind of weariness that comes from realizing a truth you'd half suspected for years. I didn't know about Lynn. I didn't know about the rest, but I always knew your father was carrying something he wouldn't name. She turned to Ethan. You remind me of him when he was young, before life hardened him. He used to believe redemption was something you could earn if you just worked hard enough. I wish he'd learned that love doesn't work like that. Ethan lowered his gaze. He wanted to make it right. I know, she said, but some things can't be made right, they can only be understood. The clock on the wall ticked once, twice before silence took over again. Later that afternoon, Colin stopped by. He handed each of us a thin envelope, our father's note, the one mentioned in the tape. He didn't stay long. Grief made visitors nervous once there was nothing left to explain. Ethan opened his first. Inside was a check, not enormous but enough to mean something, and a letter written in the same precise hand we'd come to know too well. It said only, "For the school you wanted to build. You'll know where." Mine was different. No money, just a folded photograph, Dad sitting on the porch, a hammer in one hand, a small unfinished toy car on the step beside him. On the back he'd written, "I kept trying to fix what wasn't broken. Don't repeat me." For a long time I stared at that line. It was the kind of advice that sounds simple until you realize it's a confession disguised as wisdom. By the end of the week, the will was finalized. Ethan's name went on the property deeds, the accounts, the business. My name stayed where it always had, on the edges in the footnotes. And yet I no longer felt cheated. What he'd inherited wasn't just wealth. It was the responsibility to carry a story that had almost destroyed a man. The town didn't understand it that way, of course. They saw division, scandal, drama. People whispered things like family betrayal or guilt inheritance. The local paper ran a headline, "War Heroes Final Will Split Sons, Reveals Secret Affair." They didn't know the difference between love and redemption either. I stopped going out for a while. Mom did too. Ethan, though, he didn't hide. He went to the construction yard, met the workers, shook hands. He paid off debts Dad had left quietly open, wages owed, promises half kept. He started rebuilding one of the old community houses near the edge of town. He said it was for veterans, but I think deep down he was trying to build something for Dad to give his guilt a second life. One evening he asked me to help. I almost said no, but when I saw the way his hands trembled as he held the blueprints, I couldn't. We spent that night hammering frames under the floodlights, the air thick with sawdust and damp wood. It reminded me of when we were kids, two boys in the garage, building birdhouses we never hung. The rhythm of nails against timber was the closest thing to peace we'd had in weeks. During a break, he sat on the edge of the foundation, sweat shining on his neck. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "Do you ever wonder if he was right?" "About what?" "About love being something we owe." I thought about it. The question hung there, simple and impossible. Finally, I said, "I think he confused owing with owing back. They're not the same." Ethan nodded slowly, the kind of nod that means the words will follow you long after you've stopped hearing them. Days passed. The house grew. Each nail, each beam felt like stitching through an old wound. We didn't talk much about Dad anymore, but he was there in every creak of wood, in every pause between words. One afternoon, while clearing out a shed for supplies, Ethan found another box, smaller than the rest, tucked behind old paint cans. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon. They were addressed not to Lynn but to Mom. Unsent, unopened, all written after the fire. We read only one. It began, "I keep thinking there's a right time to tell her everything, but there never is. So I tell her through work, through silence, through things I build instead of words I say." Mom read them that night and said nothing. But the next morning she opened the windows for the first time in weeks. The smell of rain and sawdust filled the house again, soft and familiar. For a moment, it almost felt like he was still there, moving through the halls, fixing something unseen. That evening, Ethan came to my room. He leaned against the doorway, the kind of tired that sits deeper than sleep. "Mom's going to donate the house," he said, "to the town for a shelter." I nodded. It's what he would have done. He smiled faintly. "No," he said, "it's what she would have wanted him to do." We stood there in the quiet, the kind that hums rather than echoes. There was no anger left, no bitterness, just an ache that knew its own name. Outside, the crickets began their chorus. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck wood, the sound carrying across the fields. It felt like a heartbeat, slow, steady, unfinished. The fallout hadn't destroyed us. It had simply changed the shape of what remained. And maybe that was all any of us could hope for, to live with the cracks and call them light. The day the letter came, the sky was that pale kind of blue that looks washed out by time, too fragile to hold clouds. It arrived by courier in a plain envelope with my name written across it in Collins's careful handwriting. The return address was his office, but I knew even before I opened it that it wasn't really from him. It was from my father. Again. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, sealed with wax. No letterhead, no formality. Just a note, for David Hale, to be delivered after the estate is settled. The house was quiet. Ethan was out at the construction site. Mom had gone to the shelter, meeting about converting our home. It was just me, the envelope, and the faint hum of a refrigerator that hadn't been cleaned since before the funeral. Funny how silence can make even the smallest sounds feel alive. I broke the seal. A faint smell of tobacco and cedar rose from the paper, his smell. And suddenly I was back in his workshop again, sawdust on the floor, the crackle of the radio, his voice humming along to some forgotten tune. It was the kind of memory that sneaks in through scent, not thought, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. The letter wasn't long, just a few paragraphs written in that same firm script I'd grown up watching across grocery lists and apology notes. David, if you're reading this, the noise has probably quieted by now. That's how life works. First the storm, then the sorting. There's something I never filed with the court. It's not property, not money. It's a second will, one I never meant to legalize but to explain. The first will was for the world. This one is for you. Asterisk. My throat tightened. The paper trembled in my hands, though I didn't want it to. I kept reading. When you were small, you used to follow me around the yard, holding that little red hammer. You'd tap at nails that weren't there and tell me you were fixing the house so it wouldn't be sad. You didn't know it then, but you were the one fixing me. I didn't leave you the company or the house because I knew what they cost me to build. They were made out of guilt and ambition. I didn't want you carrying the same currency. What I did leave you, though, you won't find on any list. It's in a file at the parish. Father Jerome kept it for me. A record of donations, payments, and one name that isn't mine. That file belongs to you now. It's a map of every place I tried to make amends. I hope you use it, not to pay debts but to finish what I couldn't. I set the letter down, staring at the words until they blurred. Outside, the wind pushed against the window pane, a soft, steady rhythm that almost sounded like breathing. I drove to the parish that evening. Father Jerome had passed years ago, but the same caretaker answered the door, an older woman with eyes that seemed to remember everything and judge nothing. She led me to the small office near the back, where the smell of wax and paper mixed with the faint sweetness of incense. There, on the shelf beside a rusted filing cabinet, was a cardboard box labeled R. Hale Outreach. Inside were folders, yellowed receipts, lists of names, and handwritten notes. But near the bottom was a small sealed envelope, newer than the rest, with my name on it again. And next to it a ledger. Its cover read, "For those who built without thanks." I opened the ledger first. It wasn't business records or donations. It was stories, short ones, half a page each. A veteran's daughter who needed surgery. A widow's mortgage quietly paid. A mechanic's tuition covered for night school. Each entry ended with the same two words written in his distinct handwriting. For Lynn. It was like he had turned her name into a prayer, one he kept saying long after anyone was left to hear it. The sealed envelope was smaller, just a single folded sheet. I opened it carefully. "Son," it began, "if you're reading this, you've probably seen what I left behind. All those receipts, all those small kindnesses I kept secret. You might think they were for her, but they were for me, for the man I kept trying to be after I stopped recognizing myself. I don't know what you'll do with the file, but I trust you'll see what I meant to teach you, that the only way to honor the past is to make it feed the living. I built houses. You build people. That's your inheritance, even if it doesn't come with keys. There's a check in the bottom of the box, don't laugh. It's not much. I want you to use it to finish something, anything that matters. And when you do, don't name it after me. Name it after what saved me, gratitude. P.S. Ethan knows where the land title is, you'll need it. The check was there, folded inside a business card from decades ago. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to start something. That night I sat on the porch, the letter resting beside me. The stars above looked faint, scattered, as if the sky itself had forgotten how to shine all at once. Mom came out quietly, wrapped in her shawl. She didn't ask what I'd found, she just sat beside me. After a while, she said, "Your father always wanted to leave something behind that couldn't burn." Her words hung between us, fragile and true. I turned to her. "I think he finally did." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Then finish it, David. Whatever it is, make it mean something." The wind lifted, carrying the smell of pine and the faint echo of hammers from the new build down the road, Ethan's project. Somewhere out there, the past and the present were shaking hands. I looked down at the second will in my lap, its edges fluttering softly in the breeze. And for the first time since his death, I didn't feel like his son trying to decode his ghosts. I felt like a man being handed a purpose. The letter had said, "Name it after gratitude." I didn't know what that would look like yet, but I knew where to start. At dawn, I'd drive back to Ethan's site. I'd bring the ledger, the check, and maybe, finally, the will to build something that wasn't meant to fix the past, but to give it somewhere to rest. I went in the late afternoon, when the heat had slipped off the day but the light still lay warm on everything it touched. The ledger sat on the passenger seat, the check tucked inside like a small heartbeat. Ethan offered to come, but I told him I needed to do this first by myself. He didn't argue. Some errands belonged to one pair of hands. The orphanage stood on the edge of town where the road thinned and the map forgot its lines. A white building with a low roof and a yard of stubborn grass, the kind that survives neglect in summer. A swing set squeaked in the faint breeze. From somewhere inside came the smell of laundry steam and something sweet cooling on a tray, cookies, maybe, or a sheet cake with crooked frosting letters. A woman met me at the door before I could knock. "Can I help you?" Her voice had a warmth that made you want to tell the truth. She wore a lanyard that said Harper House and a cardigan the color of fresh pears. "My name's David Hale," I said. "I think my father supported this place." Her expression changed in that gentle, immediate way of people who have carried gratitude long enough to recognize its family resemblance. "You're Robert's son." She led me into a lobby trimmed with paper cutouts and a bulletin board crowded with faces. Missing teeth, new backpacks, papier-mâché solar system sagging at Pluto. Down the hall, a boy ran past with a shoelace flapping behind him like a flag. The building hummed with small purposes, homework, snack time, a chore chart with stickers. I hadn't known a hum could sound like mercy. "I'm Elaine," she said, shaking my hand properly as if first impressions mattered here, even on late afternoons. "We've never had your father's family visit. He always kept things quiet." "That sounds like him," I said and surprised myself by smiling. She brought me to her office, a narrow room with a window over the garden. On the sill sat a jar full of colored pencils and a tiny plastic dinosaur guarding them like a gift no one should waste. Elaine closed the door softly and turned to the file cabinet. "We keep records of every donor," she said. "Not for plaques, just to remember the stories." She pulled a folder labeled R. Hale and set it on the desk. Inside, receipts, handwritten notes, and clipped emails printed on cheap paper so nothing digital could vanish by accident. At the bottom lay a postcard with no return address, just a photograph of a lake at dusk and 3 words written in steady block letters, "For the boys." "He sent this after we fixed the roof," Elaine said. "The storm 2 summers ago, we were short 4,000. He called, said he could cover it, and asked if we could send a photo when the tar was down. We sent the roof. He sent the lake." I opened the ledger and matched dates without trying to. November, January, April, the same rhythm as the entries in the parish box. A year of patterns that spelled out the shape of a man who built quietly and spent what he had like a language. Elaine placed another sheet in front of me. It was a list titled Winter Coats, Sizes, with a note. "If the Navy has better zippers, choose the Navy." Underneath, a second note written in my father's hand. "Add 2 more. Someone always shows up late." I felt the kind of ache that sits where laughter and grief meet. He had planned for the child who would arrive when the coats were gone. Of course he had. "Would you like to see the game room?" she asked. He helped with that too. We walked down the hall past a mural of trees painted by many hands, the trunks too thick and the birds too big, and it didn't matter. In the game room, a ping-pong table bore the scars of good days. A shelf sagged beneath board games. Sorry. Life Connect 4, names that felt like instructions if you said them slowly. On the far wall hung a corkboard with Polaroids pinned in cheerful chaos. In several of them, a tall man stood half turned away from the camera, as if shyness had outlived youth. His hand rested on a boy's shoulder on a tool handle on a can of blue paint. My father, not in a frame, but in motion. "Those were the Saturdays he fixed the back steps," Elaine said. He said he was better with a hammer than a check. We told him both were welcome. I traced a fingertip along the edge of one photo. The paint on the wall behind him was the blue of a scarf with white flowers. A door opened and a girl looked in, 10, maybe 11, hair braided in 2 ropes and knees skinned with honest effort. MS, Harper, we need markers, the good ones. Elaine apologized with her eyes and left me there. I didn't mind. The room felt like a kind of prayer you could only make by watching. A boy crept in when he thought I wasn't looking. He stopped at the doorway and pointed at the photos. "That your dad?" he said. "Yes," I answered, then added he helped here. The boy nodded with the solemnity of the very young and the very honest. "He fixed the shelf in the library so it wouldn't wobble," he said. "Books don't like falling." He came closer, slipped a hand into his pocket and pulled out a wooden car, paint chipped, axle crooked. He said, "This doesn't go fast, but it goes true." My throat tightened. The toy looked so much like the small car from that old porch picture, the one he never finished. Maybe he had here. "What's your name?" I asked. "Marcus," he said. "Are you here to play ping pong?" "Maybe later," I said. "I came to bring something." He studied my face with the kind of patience kids have when they're deciding whether to trust you. Then he held out the car. "You can borrow it," he said, "if you want." I took it carefully, the weight of it more than wood, more than paint. "Thank you," I said. "I won't keep it. I just need to remember how it feels." Elaine returned with the good markers and an expression that said she'd heard enough to know what to leave alone. She watched Marcus go, then looked back at me. "We were going to start a fund for kids aging out," she said. "Rent deposits, work boots, the unglamorous things that make a first apartment possible. Your father liked that idea. He said a roof is only useful if it covers the next day too." I opened the ledger to the last page and slipped the check between the lines. "It's not much," I said, "but it's a start." Elaine didn't look at the amount. She pressed the paper flat with the palm of her hand like you might steady a shoulder. "What name should we put on the fund?" she asked. I thought of plaques, of headlines that got us wrong, of a blue scarf, a bronze medal that wasn't about a war, a locket that meant a promise wasn't over. I thought of Ethan, of Mom, of a man who had tried to pay a debt with wood and weekends. And I thought of the word my father had written at the bottom of so many secret receipts. "Call it gratitude," I said. "No last names." Elaine smiled and wrote it down. Outside, the swing set squeaked a little less, as if the wind had shifted. On my way out, Marcus ran up and pressed the wooden car back into my hand. "You can keep it longer," he said, as if he'd thought it through. "Just bring it back when you know where it goes." "I think I do," I told him, "but I'll return it anyway." The sun had slipped low enough to slide under the eaves and pour across the yard. For a moment the whole place glowed, linoleum and lockers and laughter all caught in the same soft gold. I stood there, the toy warm in my palm, and knew what needed building next. Not a monument, not an apology, a door, one that opened. The envelope arrived without ceremony, no courier this time, no seal. Just a plain white envelope slipped under the orphanage door with my name written in ink that had bled a little from the rain. Elaine found it when she opened the front hall and handed it to me like it was fragile. "Looks like it's been waiting," she said. I turned it over. No return address, only the faint impression of a thumbprint near the corner. The handwriting was unmistakable, Collins's, looping and careful. He must have held onto this for weeks, maybe months, before deciding I was ready to see it. I stepped outside, past the laughter of children, and sat on the back steps where the paint peeled like paper bark. The air smelled of wet clay and fresh bread from the kitchen. I could hear the faint clatter of dishes, the low hum of a building full of life. It made the silence around me feel almost sacred. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, folded twice, yellowed at the edges like it had been carried through too many hands before mine. The first line stopped my breath. "If this reaches you, it means Collins has decided I've earned your forgiveness before I've even asked for it. There is one last thing I couldn't tell you in person, not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid it would make you stop listening to everything else I said. The night of the fire, when I carried Ethan out, I thought I was saving one life. I didn't know I was saving two." The words blurred, not from tears, at least not yet, but from the sheer weight of them. "Lynn was pregnant. She told me weeks later when the doctors were sure she'd live. She said it as if she was offering me something I didn't deserve, a second chance I didn't ask for. I helped her through the birth quietly, through contacts, through names that owed me favors. The baby didn't make it. He was small, too small for the world. She never blamed me. She said maybe it was the universe's way of balancing what it had taken. But I couldn't stop thinking that the child was supposed to live, that some mistake had been passed down from me to him. When she asked me to take Ethan as my own, I thought I was saying yes to her son. In my heart, I was saying yes to the one who didn't survive. The page trembled in my hands. I could hear the faint echo of hammering from the new building, Ethan's crew still working into the evening. It sounded like my father's rhythm, like the heartbeat of someone who built to keep from breaking. You and Ethan grew up as brothers, but I know I made that impossible for a while. I created a story around guilt, and you both had to live in it. If you ever wondered why I looked at him the way I did, like he was both blessing and reminder, it's because part of me believed I'd been given back what I'd lost, and part of me feared I didn't deserve to keep it. But you, David, you were the reason I finally stopped running from that fire. You were my proof that the world still trusted me enough to give me another son. I wish I had told you that sooner. A gust of wind brushed past, tugging at the edge of the letter. The air smelled faintly of rain on tin and cut grass. Somewhere behind me, a child laughed, high and pure, the kind of sound that forgives the world without knowing it. I pressed the page down against my knee and kept reading. When the time comes, I want the truth buried with the right things. Not the medals or the money, those are just metal and paper, but the things that carried the weight I couldn't. The locket, the medal, the photograph, put them where the lake meets the hill. You know the place. The one where the light catches the water in the evenings and turns it the color of forgiveness. I built my life on foundations of silence, son. I hope you build yours on grace. There was no signature this time, just a single line written beneath the last paragraph in smaller, shakier handwriting. I never wanted you to understand my mistakes. I wanted you to surpass them. I don't know how long I sat there after the words ran out. The paper grew soft in my hands, edges curling with the humidity. The sun dipped lower, brushing the orphanage walls in gold. The children's laughter faded into the hum of evening, doors closing, footsteps soft against tile, a lullaby drifting from one of the rooms upstairs. When I finally stood, I knew what I had to do. That night, I drove out to the lake. The same lake that had carried his voice through that recording, that had mirrored our grief back to us until we learned to stop fighting it. The sky was a bruised violet, the surface of the water glass smooth. I parked by the dock and walked down with the letter in one hand, the box of keepsakes in the other. Ethan was already there. He turned when he heard the gravel shift. "Collins called," he said. "He told me about the letter." I nodded and handed it to him. He read it quietly, the wind lifting the edges. When he reached the line about the child, the one who hadn't lived, he exhaled sharply, almost a whisper of a sob. "So that's why," he said, "why he couldn't look at me sometimes. Not because of what you were," I said softly, "but because of what he lost before you." We stood there, side by side, watching the water catch the first stars. Then, without speaking, we opened the small wooden box. Inside lay the locket, the medal, the photo, each one a story we had inherited but never asked to tell. Ethan lifted the medal first. The bronze had dulled, but in the fading light it still caught a glint of sun. He held it to his chest for a moment, then lowered it into the lake. It sank slowly, turning once before vanishing beneath the surface. I followed with the locket, then the photograph. They disappeared like embers into the dark water. We stood until the ripples faded. The air was still, the kind of stillness that feels like completion. Neither of us said goodbye. We didn't need to. When we turned to leave, I looked back one last time. The lake reflected the moon like a coin laid flat on glass. And for a brief moment, I could almost see him there, our father, standing where the water met the hill, his hands empty at last, his silence finally at peace. The first winter after everything changed was a quiet one. The kind of winter that didn't bring snow so much as it brought stillness, white skies, gray mornings, air that held its breath. At the orphanage, the pipes hissed with the effort of warmth, and the scent of soup drifted through the halls. Life, for once, felt ordinary, and maybe that was the miracle. I'd been helping Ethan finish the last wing of the shelter, what the town now called the Gratitude House. He hated the name at first, said it sounded like something from a brochure. But when the first group of kids came through those doors, some shy, some angry, some holding everything they owned in a plastic bag, he stopped complaining. He just stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching them run toward the warmth. That afternoon, I drove back to Mom's house for dinner. It had been months since we'd all sat at that table together. The house looked smaller now, though nothing had changed. The same chipped mug by the sink, the same calendar frozen 2 months behind. Grief has a way of slowing time until the clocks forget themselves. Mom was in the kitchen, her hair shorter, silver showing through. When she saw me, she smiled in that soft, tired way that always meant she'd been crying earlier but didn't want me to know. "I set an extra plate," she said. "Ethan's on his way." Then, after a pause, "He called me Mom on the phone yesterday, first time." I nodded, unsure what to say. The word Mom had always belonged to me, but now it belonged to him too, and somehow that didn't hurt. It felt right, like a circle finally closing. When Ethan arrived, he brought a chill with him and a box of pastries from the diner. He looked different, lighter maybe. Less like a man trying to make amends, more like one who had begun to forgive himself. We ate without ceremony. Mom said grace, short and plain. Afterward, we lingered at the table, telling stories we'd never shared when Dad was alive, his terrible cooking, his stubbornness with direction, the time he fixed the car with duct tape and faith. Laughter filled the room cautiously at first, then louder, freer. It didn't erase the years of silence between us, but it softened them, made them bearable. When the dishes were done, Mom excused herself to rest. Ethan and I sat by the fireplace, 2 cups of black coffee between us. The fire cracked softly, and the air carried that familiar mix of cedar and smoke, the scent of something that used to be home. "I visited the lake this morning," he said quietly. "It's frozen over. You can still see where the light hits the water under the ice. It looks like the metal's still shining down there." I smiled faintly. "Maybe it is." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Sometimes I wonder what he'd think if he saw all this, the house, the shelter, the way Mom's smiling again." I thought about it for a moment. "He'd say we took too long," I said. "Then he'd tell us to stop talking and pick up a hammer." Ethan laughed, and the sound felt like an exhale years overdue. We drove to the orphanage the next day. It had become our shared project, though neither of us had planned it that way. The kids called Ethan Mr. E, and they called me Dave, because formality never survived the chaos of a playground. The halls were decorated with paper snowflakes and glitter stars, and someone had hung a banner that read, "Home is something you build." Elaine met us at the door, cheeks flushed from the cold. "There's someone I'd like you both to meet," she said. She led us into the reading room, where a woman sat in a wheelchair by the window, her hands folded in her lap. Her hair was gray, her face marked by years of weather, but her eyes were familiar. "This is Sister Lynn's cousin," Elaine said. "She's been helping us with donations. Her name is Anne." For a moment I forgot how to breathe. The resemblance was faint but undeniable, the shape of her mouth, the calm in her gaze. She looked at us both, her eyes shining with something deeper than curiosity. "You're Robert's sons," she said softly. The way she said Robert, gentle, unguarded, made his name sound new again. "I remember him. I remember how he came to the hospital, how he waited outside even when he wasn't allowed in." Ethan moved closer. "You knew about the fire?" She nodded. "My cousin wrote to me afterward. She said a man had carried her and her boy from the smoke. She said he wept like someone being forgiven." Her hands trembled as she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I found this in her belongings when I came to the U.S. It was never sent. I think it was meant for him." She placed it in Ethan's hands. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the handwriting was careful and graceful. It began, "To the man who saved my life and lost a piece of his own doing it." Ethan looked at me. "You should read it." I opened it gently, afraid the paper might crumble. The words were simple, almost too simple. "You told me that love and forgiveness are the same thing, only spoken in different languages. If that's true, then I forgive you in both. When the boy grows up, tell him he was loved twice, once by me, once by you. That's more than most people get in one lifetime." I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it against my chest. Outside, snow had begun to fall, thin, hesitant flakes that melted before they touched the ground. But for a moment it looked like the world was trying to start over. Before we left, and smiled and said, "She would have wanted you both to know peace. That was her only wish." Ethan nodded. "I think we're getting there." On the drive home, the snow thickened, tracing silver lines in the headlights. Neither of us spoke much. There wasn't anything left to explain, only to feel. When we reached Mom's house, the windows glowed soft gold against the dark. Through the glass, I could see her moving in the kitchen, humming to herself. The same melody Dad used to hum while fixing things. Ethan put the car in park and looked at me. "So this is it," he said. "No," I said quietly. "This is just the part where we start living again." He nodded, eyes glistening. Then he smiled, small and true. "See you tomorrow, brother." The word hung there in the air between us, brother. No bitterness, no questions, just belonging. I stepped out into the snow. It fell slow and soft against my shoulders, the kind that doesn't sting, just settles like grace. Behind me, the engine faded, leaving only the sound of wind and the faint echo of laughter from inside the house. And as I stood there, breathing in the cold, I realized something I hadn't before. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It builds a home big enough to hold it. Spring returned slowly that year. Not the kind of spring that arrives with fanfare, but the quiet kind, the kind that sneaks up between late frosts and mornings that still smell faintly of winter. The kind that makes you notice things again. The creak of porch steps. The way sunlight finds its way through curtains that have been shut too long. The sound of life deciding to start over. At the Gratitude House, the grass had begun to push through the thaw. Children were planting seedlings in the small garden behind the main hall, carrots, mint, wildflowers that didn't know they weren't supposed to grow in hard soil. Ethan stood among them, guiding small hands with larger, steadier ones. His voice carried, soft and patient. Every time he laughed, it startled the robins into flight. I watched from the porch. There was something in that scene that felt like a full circle, the kind my father had never managed to finish but had drawn well enough for us to trace. The house wasn't just a shelter anymore. It had become a place where broken stories came to rest and sometimes to begin again. Mom visited often. She brought warm bread, old photos, and the kind of wisdom that doesn't ask to be heard, only felt. The kids adored her, called her Grandma June, followed her like shadows when she told them stories about the man who built with his heart instead of his hands. She never used his name, but I think they knew. Maybe they felt it the way we still did, in the walls, in the rhythm of the steps, in the spaces where silence had turned gentle. A few months later, the town gathered for the dedication ceremony. The mayor spoke about community, about the importance of generosity, about how one man's quiet choices could ripple into something larger than his own life. It was a good speech, but it was what came after that stayed with me. Elaine took the stage with a group of the children, their hands clasped, eyes wide with the kind of awe only a crowd can summon. She read from a small plaque we'd mounted near the garden. It said, "For those who build what cannot be seen, and for those who learn that love, when done right, leaves room for others to grow." No name, just that. The audience stood silent for a long moment before the applause began, not the loud kind, the kind that rises slow, more reverence than celebration. When it ended, Ethan looked at me, eyes bright under the sun. "He'd like this," he said. "He'd pretend he didn't," I replied. "But he would." Ethan smiled. Maybe that's our inheritance, learning to love what he was too proud to admit he needed. Later that night, after the guests had gone, we stayed behind. The moon hung low over the lake, a soft gold coin pressed against the horizon. We stood by the dock, the air cool, the world unhurried. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out something small wrapped in a cloth. When he unfolded it, I saw the wooden toy car, the one from Marcus, the one our father had once left unfinished. "I think it's time," he said. He set it gently on the water. The car floated for a moment, the wood catching the moonlight, the reflection trembling with each small wave. Then it drifted out, slow, unresisting, until the darkness of the lake took it. Neither of us spoke. There are moments when silence says exactly what it should. When we finally turned back toward the house, the lights glowed in the windows, soft, golden, alive. You could hear laughter from inside, someone playing a guitar badly, the kind of chaos that sounds like peace when you've learned what the absence of it feels like. And in that instant, I realized something. Legacy isn't about what we leave behind. It's about what keeps growing after us. Weeks passed. Spring turned to summer. The shelter filled with stories, each one carrying a piece of ours. A boy named Marcus won a school award for a story he wrote about a man who fixed shelves so books could stop falling. A teenager who'd arrived with nothing but anger learned how to repair bicycles, then started teaching others. A young mother found her footing again, moved out, and left a note that read, Thank you for reminding me that families can be built twice. And somewhere in all of that, I stopped thinking of the gratitude house as Dad's redemption. It wasn't. It was ours. Every nail, every repaired window, every seed in the garden was a testament that pain can grow into something kind if you give it the right soil. One evening, as I was locking up, I saw a boy sitting on the front steps. He looked about 9, his backpack resting beside him, his face smudged with travel and fatigue. He said he was waiting for someone to pick him up, but no one came. So I sat beside him. After a while he asked, "Do you live here?" "Sort of," I said. "I help people find their way." He nodded thoughtfully, then asked, "And who helps you?" I smiled. "The people who walk in." He looked at me puzzled but said nothing more. When Elaine came to bring him inside, I stayed a moment longer on the steps, the boy's question still lingering in the air. "Who helps you?" It struck me then. My father had spent his whole life trying to atone for the people he couldn't save. But in doing so, he forgot that saving isn't something you do for others. It's something you do with them, together. And maybe that's what we were finally learning. A year later, on what would have been his birthday, Ethan and I took Mom back to the lake. The air smelled of pine and rain. She held the new plaque we'd made, a small bronze plate etched with 3 words that had come to define everything we'd become: love, forgive, build. We placed it at the base of the oak tree overlooking the water. Mom touched the bark and whispered something too soft to hear. When she turned, her eyes were wet, but her smile was steady. "He was never trying to be perfect," she said. "He just didn't know he was already enough." She looked at us both, her hand resting on mine, then Ethan's. "Now you boys do what he couldn't, teach others that." The wind moved through the leaves, the kind of wind that sounds like a sigh and a promise at once. For a moment, I could almost see him again, standing by the dock, looking out across the water, his shoulders no longer heavy, his face untroubled. Then the image faded, replaced by the reflection of the 3 of us together. That night after we dropped Mom home, Ethan and I sat outside the orphanage. The lights from the porch cast soft halos across the gravel. Children's drawings hung in the windows, crayon suns, stick figures holding hands, one big heart drawn too wide for the paper. Ethan broke the silence first. "You ever wonder what people will remember about us?" "Maybe not the details," I said. "Maybe just how it felt to be around us." He nodded, thoughtful. "Then I hope they feel peace." He stood, stretched, and walked toward the gate, calling back over his shoulder, "Same time tomorrow." I smiled. Always. When he was gone, I stayed a while longer. The night hummed softly, the wind, the faint creak of the swings, the pulse of something enduring. I closed my eyes, and for the first time I didn't feel haunted by what had been left unsaid. I felt guided by it, because that's what legacy really is. Not memory, not monument, but motion, something that keeps going even after the story ends. If you've listened this far, maybe some part of this story found its way into you. Maybe it reminded you of your own father, or of a wound that never quite healed. Or maybe it simply reminded you that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing peace over proof. What I've learned through all of this is that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by who stays when the fire has burned everything else away. And gratitude, the kind my father wrote about, isn't just saying thank you. It's living in a way that honors the second chances we're given. So if you're listening tonight, I hope you call someone you haven't spoken to in a while. Tell them you miss them. Tell them you're sorry, even if you don't know exactly what for. Because sometimes healing begins not with answers, but with the sound of your own voice choosing to try again. Thank you for being part of this journey, for listening, feeling, and remembering alongside this family. If this story touched you, I'd be deeply grateful if you subscribed to the channel, shared it with someone who might need to hear it, and joined us again for more stories that explore what truly makes us human. Take care of yourself. Take care of your loved ones. And remember, the greatest inheritance any of us can leave behind is kindness that keeps on moving. Until next time, may your days be gentle, your nights peaceful, and your family, no matter how it's built, always feel like home.